All right, picture this. Have you ever heard of someone being thrown in prison for breaking a legal contract that, legally speaking, never even existed in the first place? I know, it sounds like a total paradox, right? But it's exactly what went down in this absolutely fascinating legal saga that made its way all the way to the highest court in the Philippines. Today, we're unpacking the landmark Supreme Court decision of Pulido versus People of the Philippines. And let me tell you, it is an incredible explainer involving 2 marriages, missing documents, a massive reversal of decades-old legal precedent, and the true definition of what actually makes a crime. So here's our roadmap for today's explainer. First, a tale of 2 marriages. Then we'll look at the anatomy of a bigamy charge. Number 3 is void versus voidable marriages. After that, the old rule on remarriage. Then the Supreme Court's plot twist, and finally, number 6, the final verdict. Let's just jump right in.
Section 1. A Tale of 2 Marriages. The Pulido Case.
Okay, so the story really begins way back in 1983. At just 16 years old, Luisito Pulido married his teacher, Nora Arcon, in a civil ceremony. Fast forward over a decade to 1995, and Pulido marries another woman, Rowena Balamadeda. Now get this. He and his first wife, Nora, actually kept living together until 2007. That's when Pulido just stopped coming home. When Nora confronted him, she uncovered the second secret marriage. Understandably hurt by the betrayal, Nora filed a bigamy charge against Pulido and his second wife right then in 2007.
Now, Pulido didn't deny having 2 ceremonies, not at all, but his defense was incredibly technical. He basically argued that both of his marriages were completely 100% invalid under the law right from the very beginning. And because of that, he couldn't possibly be guilty of bigamy. Well, the lower courts, they didn't buy it for a second. They found him guilty beyond a reasonable doubt and sentenced the guy to prison. Moving on to Section 2, Anatomy of a Bigamy Charge, Article 349. To really get why he was convicted, we need to look at Article 349 of the Revised Penal Code. For a bigamy conviction to stick, the prosecution has to prove 4 exact elements. First, the offender has to have been legally married. Second, that first marriage must not have been legally dissolved. Third, the person contracts a second or subsequent marriage. And fourth, that second marriage would have been perfectly valid if the first one wasn't standing in the way. You see, the core logic behind Article 349 is all about preserving and protecting the juridical tie of marriage. The crucial point here is that it penalizes the deliberate act of marrying someone new while a former, totally valid marriage is still legally active. Simply put, if you have a valid marriage, you can't just act like you don't.
All right, Section 3. Void versus voidable marriages. The legal building blocks.
Now, this is where it gets really interesting. In law, there is a massive difference between a void marriage and a voidable marriage. A void marriage, or void ab initio, is basically non-existent from the very beginning. Think of it like a building that was never even constructed. There's just absolutely nothing there. A voidable marriage, on the other hand, is more like a building with a cracked foundation. It stands perfectly fine and it produces legal effects, right up until a judge officially tears it down through an annulment. So, Pulido's entire defense rested on this one huge claim. His 1983 marriage to Nora Arcon was completely missing a legal marriage license. And in Filipino law, lacking an essential requisite like a marriage license makes a marriage void ab initio. To Pulido, his first marriage was that building that was never constructed. Because of that, he argued that the first element of bigamy, being legally married in the first place, was completely missing.
Which brings us to Section 4. The old rule on remarriage, Article 40.
So if his marriage was void, why did the lower courts convict him? Well, they relied heavily on Article 40 of the Family Code. This rule essentially says you can't just decide for yourself that your marriage is void. Even if you know for a fact it's missing a license, you still need a court's final judgment declaring it void before you can legally marry someone else. And because Pulido didn't get that court order before marrying his second wife in 1995, the lower courts just treated his first marriage as if it were completely valid.
But wait, this brings us to the ultimate mystery the Supreme Court had to solve. Does a civil rule, one that's designed to guide administrative processes for remarriage, actually have the power to dictate guilt in a criminal bigamy case? Like, can the state actually put you in prison for bigamy based on a procedural technicality, even if that first marriage was legally just a ghost?
Let's get into the climax. Section 5. Supreme Court's plot twist, reversing precedent.
Here is where the Supreme Court dropped a massive plot twist. They completely reversed their previous stance. Decades of precedent, gone. They ruled that a void ab initio marriage absolutely is a valid defense against bigamy, even if you didn't get a court decree before your second marriage.
They basically said, look, if a marriage is void from the very start, there is no valid first marriage to protect. Therefore, that first essential element of the crime of bigamy, it's just completely missing.
To justify this huge shift, the court applied a fundamental legal tiebreaker known as in dubio pro reo, which means, when in doubt, rule for the accused. They explained that penal laws, the laws that actually put people in prison, must be strictly construed against the state and liberally in favor of the accused. You simply cannot stretch a criminal statute to punish someone for an act it doesn't explicitly cover. No way.
Let's break down how the court systematically dismantled the old logic, because it's pretty brilliant. First, they reiterated that a void marriage means no first marriage ever existed, period. Second, and this is incredibly important, they clarified that Article 40 of the Family Code is strictly a rule for remarriage. It was never intended to repeal or amend the criminal requirements of Article 349. Third, Article 349 only penalizes you for marrying while a valid or voidable marriage is active. It literally doesn't apply to void marriages. And finally, criminal laws cannot be expanded by implication just because you want to punish someone acting in bad faith.
Now for the resolution. Section 6, the final verdict, the missing license.
With this entirely new legal framework in place, the court looked at the actual evidence, and it was wild. The civil registrar confirmed back in 2008 that Pulido's 1983 marriage documents were completely missing from the official registry. There was zero entry of a license ever being issued. And shockingly, the registrar actually added a note stating the original documents were possibly eaten by termites. Seriously. Because there was no official record, there was massive reasonable doubt that a marriage license had ever existed in the first place.
Furthermore, totally backing up his claim, Pulido had actually secured a civil decree in 2016. Keep in mind, this was while his criminal case was still ongoing. This decree legally proved that his first marriage was an absolute nullity. A court had officially declared that his 1983 marriage was void from the absolute very beginning. So, because reasonable doubt existed regarding the validity of that very first marriage, which means the prosecution completely failed to prove element number 1, the Supreme Court completely exonerated Pulido. They wiped away the bigamy conviction entirely. He was officially acquitted. This landmarked case leaves us with a really profound and provocative thought to end on. It highlights the immense power of the state to take away freedom, sure, but it also reinforces the absolute necessity of proving every single element of a crime. Think about it. If a criminal charge requires breaking a legal contract, can the state punish you if that contract never even existed in the first place? Well, thanks to Luisito Pulido's case, in the Philippines, the answer is definitively no. Thanks so much for joining me on this explainer, and I will catch you on the next one.